everyone. We're just giving a minute or two for everyone to have a chance to join up that might be wanting to join us today. Thanks so much for joining us. In case there are people here who don't know us, I'm Linda Dubrow-Marshall.
And I'm Rob Dubrow-Marshall. I can see a few people joining as well. But welcome everyone. Thank you for being here.
Our topic today is self-care and relearned resilience during the coronavirus pandemic. So we tweaked our title just today after an interesting philosophical discussion between ourselves, where we thought that we really meant relearned resilience rather than resilience. I will get to that in a little while. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a really brief inventory of self-care so you get the idea of what we mean by that. We're going to take a look at the professional ethical requirements for self-care and the various challenges and opportunities that we have for self-care during this time of crisis. We'll be highlighting our research on self-care, which informed a model that we created called the Dubrow-Marshall swimmer model. So we'll be doing some virtual swimming soon. And we're going to talk about learned or relearned resilience in the pandemic. So that's our overview. We have a detailed inventory of self-care. We're not going to use that today, but to give you an idea, we've done a brief version of it. And it asks you to inventory yourself over the past week. And the idea there is that it's current and that you can monitor this regularly. So you could do this once a week, you could do it once a month. If you haven't been doing it at all, you could do it once a year. But the idea is that on some periodic basis, you check in with yourself. And we made it as a Likert scale from not at all to most or all of the time. And just ask yourself over the past week, have you had a good night's sleep? Many people's sleep has been affected by the pandemic. Did you spend any quality time with a friend through one of the virtual platforms? Did you exercise as is being recommended all the time? Did you have time to yourself when you did not have to take care of others, because many people are now have much increased caring responsibilities because of the situation? Are you eating well, nutritious food? And add your own meaningful self-care activities and things that are important to you. And so that gives you an idea of something that you can be doing to keep an eye on yourself.
And just to say, you can immediately see with the inventory that some of the items will have a different meaning for people now during the pandemic, during the lockdown and shutdown than it would have done previously. So I think it's actually a really interesting challenge to a lot of questionnaires and instruments as to how they're interpreted in different contexts. But particularly with regard to self-care, some of these maybe for some people they're having too much time to themselves right now. The issue of loneliness and isolation is a real one for a number of people. So whereas that might have been seen as a method to self-care previously, it might not now. So learning about how to take care of oneself, of course, is in that sense a moving feast according to the context, and we'll come back to those issues.
Great. So there are professional ethical requirements for self-care, and we're going to take an overview of these. So according to the BPS practice guidelines, so this is for practitioners, they stress it is important that psychologists from all disciplines look after their own well-being, not only for themselves as individuals, but for the quality of care that they give their clients. In their practice, within their continuing professional development plans, and within their supervision, psychologists should consider self-care and how they can maintain their own well-being. So this is seen as a responsibility and as an imperative. And I often start my own supervision sessions just saying kind of how I am personally. It's not a therapy session, but I like to check in and just highlight any particular stresses I might have been under. For another example, we look to the BACP, the British Association for Counseling and Psychotherapy, and they use the word responsibility. We take responsibility for our own well-being. So we take precautions to protect our own physical safety. This is really important right now. People are having discussions about doing sessions remotely and at what point they should resume seeing people in person and what that would mean for their safety and the safety of their clients. Monitoring your own psychological and physical health, and we gave you an example of that with the inventory. Seeking professional support and services as the need arises. So you have to recognize when you're not up to par, and perhaps you've been very upset by the things that are going on and you don't feel that you could work with clients at this time. And there's that word that we all strive for and find difficult, keeping a healthy balance between our work and other aspects of life. Always a challenge in the best of times. So remember, it's an imperative. It's like a prescription, but it's up to you to fill it and to fulfill those responsibilities. So what are some of the challenges? And we've divided these into cognitive versus affective challenges.
And often it's the case that we think about the emotional affective aspects, which we'll come on to in a moment. But for us, it's very important also as psychologists to understand the cognitive aspects of self-care and of coping, and indeed of stress, and we'll come back to a number of those issues as we proceed today. I haven't got enough time to do all of it, unfortunately, but we will come back to those issues. And therefore, how to process information, particularly when one could say that governments give out mixed messages. It's hard to know, in that sense, what to believe. The information is constantly changing, and there's so much information out there, what Kenneth Gergen called in the pre-internet world multiphrenia, and there's a lot going on. And it's also, of course, a time, and this word has been way overused, but an unprecedented crisis, when many people don't feel they have any previous experience to call upon. However, and this relates to the emotional affective part of it, of course it can trigger flashbacks. And so we've come up with the term a cognitive affect bridge as a way of being able to look both emotionally but also cognitively at how reacting to a time like this, in a sense, reactivates schemas, aspects of self-categorization, and it may take individuals to times and places in the past which do have an emotional valence, but which are also fundamentally cognitive as well. Shall we advance on to
yes, please.
Next slide. So in that sense, opportunities for coping during this time are also cognitive as well as emotional. So the importance of critical thinking, the ability to strengthen a sense of self-trust. I'm still able fundamentally to distinguish between right and wrong, the ability to also be able to distinguish between what is reasonable and unreasonable aspects of anxiety. All of that is really important at a time like this, in my view. So those are what we call the cognitive aspects of coping and of self-care. So if we move on to the affective and emotional, Linda.
Okay, so the information that we're receiving, it's not like normal information that we get. It's really emotional to take it in. And it's difficult to tolerate the painful emotions that we are experiencing. And many people will have had dysfunctional families or group experiences where they've been taught to deny their feelings, minimize their feelings, be very controlled. And so this is something that needs to be overcome. And all of this may trigger flashbacks to earlier difficult times and affect bridge to other hard times.
And that's where you have an emotional, that's where you have a feeling about what's happening, which usually doesn't take you to a good place, although there can be positive affect bridges, but usually they're felt as negative. And of course, it's possible to misinterpret or to commit an attribution error and to blame that on oneself. I'm just not able to cope, when actually this may be taking you to a place. It's important to be able to recognise that feeling and deal with it not as a problem that you're making, but as a natural part of that cognitive emotional linkage back to a different period in one's life.
And so the challenge here is to work toward an acceptance of a full range of emotions. And this means acknowledging that if you're feeling fearful or anxious, these are normal responses during a crisis, especially a crisis like this one that is potentially life-threatening. So it's really not something that you would say you have post-traumatic stress about this crisis, because it's currently happening. And the reactions that people are having are acute stress, and they're normal. So now we can talk about some of our research on self-care.
Yeah, so we wanted to really go through research that we carried out, where we developed and then deployed what we referred to as a self-care inventory. As we mentioned earlier on, we gave you some of the, went through some of the questions on that. And we developed that specifically for mental health professionals, but it potentially could be used more widely or modified. As Linda said earlier, we also use this to develop a model for self-care. And one of the goals, I think, in a way, is to try to find out whether self-care exists as a phenomenon separate from some of the other terms that and constructs that have been developed in recent times, like well-being, like coping, like resilience, like grit. And of course, psychologists, I think, need to be self-critical about our ability to create constructs and measures for them, which can give the appearance of relating to a real phenomenon, when actually they may be overlaid in an intersection of several existing phenomena. So with all of that in mind, we'll present our initial findings, and we'll go later on to apply this to the current context. So the research that we undertook was in two phases. The first was a qualitative study where a sample of counsellors working at a university counselling service were interviewed, as well as a sample of independent mental health professionals. So the professionals concerned therefore came from across different types of working, some more in a team situation potentially, others more working alone. As I say, we conducted thematic analysis based on those interviews. We could go into a lot more detail about this study, but we want to go on to talk about the scale and also the model that came on from that. So just to give an indication that, and please come in, Linda, as well, of course, some of these key themes included the inability to take time off, the pressure of work in part, but also feeling guilty when the people did take time off, when the mental health professionals did go away, and the pressure then of clients getting in touch. This is something obviously that all mental health professionals have to work with that as part of their practice. The pressure and responsibility of high-risk clients was also a theme that came out of these particular interviews. The pressure of admin work, something probably that all of us, regardless of whether we're counsellors or psychotherapists or counselling psychologists, can relate to. Also, interestingly, the lack of reflection time, that lack of simply being able to sit back and reflect, which is really, really important in most walks of life, but particularly in counselling psychology, and on occasions a feeling of isolation. Now, we could do a much more in-depth presentation, and we can do that another time or share that with you if people have questions. But we very much used the thematic analysis to guide us, in a sense, to the type of questions that we could then ask as part of an inventory on self-care. What were people doing to take care of themselves in the context in which they were working? And so we constructed an inventory, and we did this basically looking at different self-care practices. and we were mindful of a number of existing pieces of work that related to this. So, Linda?
Yes, sorry. Yes, so we used some items from psychologist Ricky Greenwald, the core outcome measure, which some of you might be familiar with, and self-constructed items. And we had a balance of positively worded and negatively worded items, and looked at people at conferences, counseling services, and independent practitioners. And then second study, we looked at the distribution, statistics, factor analysis, and correlational analysis of the survey.
So we'll just quickly run through these, mindful of the other material we want to get through. So, so I did two at once. So in terms of the overall sample, and in many respects, this could be thought of as an initial scoping or pilot study to create the inventory in its initial form. So we were very much in the initial construction phase and have sought to go on to test, retest subsequently. So we had a sample of 101 participants. The range on this instrument was from 25 to 125, and the mean is shown now 92.62 standard deviation. And we wanted to give you a feel for the distribution curve. So this is the total distribution for the total scores on the inventory. We'll come on to the factor analysis in a moment. A picture tells 1,000 words. Of course, we all know that this is one of the ways of judging whether there is a skewed distribution. So not too bad would be my non-scientific way of putting it. I put it like this, I've seen lots more skewed diagrams than this in the past and since. But obviously this just gives you an indication, which we then explored further. And what we wanted to do was look at whether out of the items that we'd put together, based on those other pieces of previous work, whether there were particular factors or clusters of the items. And three potential factors appeared to emerge from a factor analysis, exploratory factor analysis using principal components analysis that we conducted. These fell into what we then qualitatively described as three factors or potential subscales. Psychological health being the first, with an eigenvalue there of 5.8, social support being the second, and work-life balance being the third. In terms of the SQUE plot, and again I take a lot of import from SQUE plots, in one sense more than the eigenvalues, and so a very steep drop after factor 1, a less steep drop after factor 2 and 3, but nevertheless factors 4 onwards are quite similar. So despite the fact there's quite a big drop after the first eigenvalue, we felt, at least initially, that there was enough to go on with regard to perhaps considering the three-factor solution. Obviously this is something that needs to be retested will need to be and will subsequently be tested on other populations. So there were 7 items on the psychological health subscale or factor or potential subscale. This could also be potentially described as well-being, so there's different ways of being able to describe this. This included, and most of them were negative aspects, so you can turn it around, you can see the negative as a positive, meaning the opposite: tension, anxiety, lacking energy, enthusiasm. Obviously those are negative aspects of psychological health, but the less somebody answered to those would indicate more positive well-being: happiness, stroke unhappiness, crying, disturbing thoughts, feelings, and possible substance abuse. So 7 items from the scale that original scale that clustered into potentially an item around, factor around psychological health. Now, a slightly more positively skewed distribution for this, which of course doesn't mean that that's not telling you something about where the psychological health of the practitioners was at that time, but of course it does make it more difficult with regard to running parametric statistics. Social support was the second of the potential factors or subscales. And this is really, obvious, really, in a sense, what this means: quality time with others, supportive talks with others, being able to discuss work issues, camaraderie. Left work on time is an item where you can sometimes follow the numbers, which we did largely here, or sometimes you can follow what the items mean, and I can see how that one, in a sense, could also fit into work-life balance. Same with took time for a meal, but nevertheless they clustered more around the other social support items, which were a little more normally distributed perhaps than psychological health. And then finally, work-life balance, which only had 4 items, so potentially those 2 items I just mentioned could potentially, if we were going to construct a subscale for future use, could fall into the social support one, but quality time with others, time to myself, did something enjoyable, and exercise. So those were the items of work-life balance, and here actually slightly negatively skewed distribution, which I also find interesting with regard to the positively distributed one with regard to psychological health, given that that indicated more anxiety, etc. So we then, in terms of establishing internal reliability and aspects of the constructs, we conducted a correlation analysis between the 3 factors and potential subscales, finding small but highly significant correlations between the 3 factors, 3 subscales. This is a scatter plot showing you the relationship between psychological health and social support. Slightly higher, but still fairly low correlation, but highly significant between psychological health and work-life balance, and similar size between social support and work-life balance. So what this indicated was that there was a good degree of positive relationship between the subscales, and indeed the regression analysis that we ran next indicated that put together, using the Enter method into multiple linear regression, social support and work-life balance were significant predictors of psychological health. However, if you separated them out and off into them separate steps, only one of them would remain, and it was either way regardless of the order of entry. Therefore, what this indicates, as did the collinearity stat, which is that there was high collinearity between the 2 predictors. So what that indicates potentially is that these potential subscales may just be an artifact of this particular data set. However, the fact that we had originally constructed the items based on an analysis of previous work might mean that there's something worth investigating further with regard to the different aspects of this scale. So obviously the inventory needs a lot more work, and that's work that we're continuing to do, but it does indicate, perhaps unsurprisingly, a potentially close relationship between social support, family, friends, colleagues, others, work-life balance, and also psychological health or well-being. And of course, this is just a small addition to a huge body of work on well-being that suggests similarly. But for us also was interesting with regard to the kind of self-care strategies, and indeed, in one sense, triangulated back to the themes that arose out of the thematic analysis. These were the kind of things, in other words, the social support, work-life balance, that people were attempting to do for themselves, and therefore that might be an indication of whether somebody was actually advancing better self-care in light of the stresses that they were facing compared to somebody who perhaps was not. And so whether the inventory will turn out to be more of a diagnostic tool, just to say, is somebody able to learn self-care and is advancing it for themselves, versus being able to actually quantify it, remains one of those interesting empirical questions, I think, for the future. Obviously, the limitations are profound in any initial pilot and test. This was an opportunity to test out whether an inventory could be created of this degree. There's a lot more that could be done with regard to selecting participants in further phases in the future. Now, from this research, I'll hand back to Linda to introduce this. We then took what we'd found, particularly regarding aspects of social support and work-life balance and different parts of psychological health, to construct the following model for self-care as a way of being able to then potentially work with people in different settings to help them advance their self-care.
Right, so SWIMMER stands for self-care with information management, moderation, empathy, and resources. All will become clear. Just to say, we applied this model in our work with abuse survivors, and we have published this as a chapter in that book on Cult Recovery, a Clinician's Guide. So, self-care with information management, moderation, empathy, and resources. So, starting with the self-care. Here we present to you some research that's been done on strategies for self-care, practicing mindfulness, but that's not for everyone. So if not, some other type of relaxation. Looking for silver linings or being optimistic, drawing from positive psychology. Social support, as we've been talking about. Seeking out good supervisors and colleagues. Get moving, go outside is now an ironic one at the moment. And making your life meaningful. This was another piece of research on just getting down to 5 factors, 5 ways of well-being. Connect, be active, take notice, keep learning, and give. And because there's so few words there, that can be a very handy one to keep at your disposal and remind yourself and take inventory of how you're doing on those aspects. This comes from John Norcross and Barnett. These are 12 evidence-based self-care strategies that have been found for psychologists, but can certainly apply to other people as well. Valuing yourself as a person, refocusing on the rewards. So you're perhaps questioning, why am I doing this? I feel burnt out. Remember what attracted you in the first place. What are the rewards? Recognize the hazards and think of how you can cope with those and minimize those. Remember your body and what you need to take care of yourself physically. The need for nurturing relationships. It doesn't have to be any particular kind of relationship. It doesn't have to be a partner, for example, but you need relationships that nurture you and give back to you. Boundaries are a really good mechanism for self-care. A little bit of cognitive therapy here, restructuring some of your cognitions, questioning some of your beliefs, sustaining healthy escapes, which I'm finding challenging at the moment, creating a flourishing environment, and that can be little things, just what in your environment makes you feel reinvigorated. Like our page has plants, and that is one thing you could do. You might have books, you might have pictures, just what makes you feel better in your environment. Perhaps undergoing your own personal therapy, cultivating spirituality and a sense of purpose or mission, and paying attention to your creative side, fostering your creativity and growth. So those came from that piece of research. And just thinking about what do you do to relax and experiencing relaxation through all of your senses. So there's a picture that I find relaxing because I love the sound of water, the smell of flowers. I could dip my finger in that water and feel the coolness or warmth. I can just do that using my imagination. So it's what I see and what I hear, the taste perhaps of the moisture in the air. And the more rich your image is, the more potentially relaxing to you it is. And here are some reflections that may aid in self-care and lead to an increased sense of well-being. So acknowledge that you are living through a uniquely challenging and difficult time. And be open with yourself. How are you suffering? In what ways are you hurting? Be aware, because that's how you can take care of yourself. You have to identify what is impacting you in particular. To whom is it safe to share? And you might have to experiment with that and share parts of your story and see how you're being received and supported before going forward and sharing on a more deep level. Some people find reading about experiences of other people to be something that makes them feel supported. And then, what are you proud of? What have you done during this difficult time? Here we all are adopting the Blackboard Collaborate. So that's an adaptation we've made. What changes have you incorporated into your professional life and your personal life? What might you be proud of? So taking inventory of that. Have you grown? Because in every trauma, there's the potential for post-traumatic growth. And some of the qualities that are considered in post-traumatic growth are some people develop new perspectives on life. Some people find that right now they're thinking about what's important and how society can help individuals and how we might be fair or more equal. From suffering comes compassion. And it sometimes increases our sense of gratitude for various things that we are grateful for. Perhaps it's made you more sensitive, more patient, more tolerant, more open-minded. So these are some of the constructs of post-traumatic growth. Has your relationships been affected? Have any of them been affected personally or positively? Have they been strengthened? Do you feel closer to people, more intimate, more supportive of other people? Are there special difficulties in your relationships that will have to be dealt with once the crisis is over? Because sometimes you just have to get through the crisis, but it's highlighting for you some things that really need evaluating and reevaluation afterwards. So, moving forward, how might you use what you have learned from how you've been coping with this time going forward? And that might mean that you've learned some things about gaps in your life and what you need to fill and work on in the future. Moving on to information management, which is something that you don't often see in a self-care model, but which we think is really, really key. There's so much information. Whoa, that's our picture there. So how much time do you spend reading or listening to the media? I don't really want to see the reports on my iPhone because I've spent more time reading news items than I normally do. But how much of this information is accurate? So what's that balance you can find between being informed and taking a break, turning off your devices and just taking a break from it? Self-care can include getting really absorbed in a good novel or a movie that has nothing to do with the present. And then these are just some of the information that we have to manage, all the details about our students, how to stay up to date with the academic field. Those articles are being published all the time. How do you make an original contribution to research given all the research that has been done? How much time outside of teaching is required for you to prepare and review? So all these demands. So part of the answer, once you've taken stock of all your information and thought about how you can manage some of that overload of information, is moving toward moderation. Again, this is very key to our model. Pacing yourself, hour by hour, day to day, week to week, minute to minute. Looking for work-life balance, which we like to kid as like life-life balance because work is part of life. So how to manage those things. So how can we use moderation in our academic world? How do we moderate access to us by students and colleagues? Some people do that by saying there's only certain times that they'll go on their emails. Some people find it better to have more unusual hours on their emails, but take breaks during normal times. How do we moderate our emotional responses to students and colleagues? So what do we do to calm ourselves down if people are very upset around us? How do we adjust or moderate our expectations of what we can do for our students? We cannot do everything. And our students also need to understand what we can offer and what we cannot offer. So that's another example of moderation. Moderating expectations of how much research we can accomplish, particularly with all the other demands that are upon us. How do we use moderation in our personal world? Do we moderate access to us by relatives? Are we always on the phone? Do we respond to texts as soon as they come in? How many phone calls should we take from our relatives and friends? How involved should we get in the emotional responses of other people? When do we need to pull ourselves back? What are our expectations of what we can do for our family members and our friends? What are we expecting of ourselves? So often it's just unrealistic and even soul destroying what we expect of ourselves, which we summarize as we're only human after all.
And of course, this is a good example of how moderation pre-pandemic and lockdown, we constructed from our research to mean these particular things potentially to people, albeit something we would always want to get particularities about. So this is not meant to be a rigid list. But of course, in that sense, there can be such thing as too much moderation, perhaps. So at the moment, our access to relatives is highly moderated. And so different contexts, particularly profound changes, can, of course, mean that one has to relearn self-care, relearn resilience, potentially, is one of our key reflections right now.
Indeed. So now we move on to empathy. So what is empathy? What do people mean by it? So we've offered a definition from the BACP as well as from medical education, and a cognitive attribute. Sometimes people don't really think of empathy as cognitive, but it is in part cognitive because you have to understand the experiences of others and you have to be able to communicate that understanding to others. It's quite an interesting definition. And in the counseling profession, similarly, the ability to communicate understanding of another person's experience from that person's perspective. So it's very phenomenological in that sense. It's gentle, it's respectful of ourselves and other people, it's careful. You have to really ponder things. We share thoughts, feelings, caring, concern, and we hold or contain the other. And there's a lot of talk in psychotherapeutic literature about the holding and containment aspect of psychotherapy. It involves a balance and some good boundaries too. And sometimes I think of it as really, really caring for another person and yet really, really letting it go outside of the session. So being very involved, but also detaching afterwards to take care of oneself and to regroup. Sometimes it's harder to have empathy toward ourselves than other people. And that's that inner critic that we nurture and nourish too much. And so it's useful to remember we cannot take care of others without taking care of ourselves. And sometimes that means putting ourselves first, not something to feel guilty about. And just to say, we like the analogy of the airplane there, where you put the oxygen mask on yourself before putting it on your child, which in some ways, of course, is counterintuitive. And the final part of our model is R for resources. And all right, do you try to do everything yourself? Do you delegate tasks? Do you accept all requests, or can you say no? Can you refer on to other people? At this time, are you taking advantage of well-being support that is offered by the university? Do you let anyone else take care of you sometimes? These are just some examples of resources. And so now we move on to research on self-care in the pandemic.
And as we've reviewed both the inventory but also the model, we've recognised, of course, that like with so much else, this was designed pre-pandemic, and it seems to be the case and is likely to be the case that the pandemic is having some long-term implications for how we operate, and in that sense, these things need to be revisited. We make the assumption that, at least for some people, the conditions have impacted negatively on aspects of psychological health. The evidence is very mixed, though, and actually there is some evidence that some people have actually reacted well to this changed environment. As usual, there were lots of individual differences, but self-care in that sense and other related concepts arguably need to be revisited. And in particular, in our view, the aspects that we drew out from the research on the inventory originally around social support and work-life balance. And the integrated research review that we are underway with has indicated that these are factors in a whole range of potential health emergencies and other forms of responses to crises, that the ability to be able to reach out, but also fundamentally the ability still to have balance and not to be consumed by the crisis is very important. This relates potentially to work on resource depletion, personal resource depletion, and definitions of stress, that classic Cox and McKay definition of perceived demands outweighing perceived capabilities. And in that sense, the lack of social support, the perceived lack of anywhere else to go, can be seen as obviously things that potentially undermine mental health and resilience. So our concerns is for so many other mental health professionals and researchers right now is how can self-care and resilience be relearned in this new era, and we're really in the very early stages, of course, of exploring that both theoretically but also practically with individuals. So this is where we've just modified the term learned resilience and the excellent work that has been done by many researchers, including, of course, Simon, with regard to academic resilience, and thought about how, in a sense, we're having to relearn the tricks of the trade, so to speak. We learn how to be resilient, how to take care of ourselves in this changed environment.
So the American Psychological Association had a real push toward doing research on resilience because they wanted to do something to help Americans to cope with the effects of 9/11. And some people have the impression that different people are resilient. You either were or you weren't resilient. Whereas the research concluded that resilience can be learned, or as we're saying today, relearned. So they looked to see what characteristics were held by people who were more resilient and came up with 10 tips for resilience. Now, Mark Widdowson has already done a YouTube presentation, which is on the Wellness tab of the Health and Society Blackboard site, about the 10 tips of resilience. So these are all really helpful, but we're only going to look at 2 of them today, because you can look at Mark's for the rest. And one is avoid seeing crises as insurmountable problems. So there may be times when it feels like insurmountable problems. And indeed, we cannot change the fact that highly stressful events happen and are happening, but we can work cognitively on how we're interpreting and responding to these events. And one strategy there is to try looking beyond the present to how future circumstances may be at least a little bit better, and to look for subtle ways in which you might already feel somewhat better as you adjust and as you're dealing with difficult situations. And as we said before, as you might be proud of various things that you've done. And the second one was accepting that change is part of living. That's the one thing we can be certain of, is that change will occur. Certain goals may no longer be attainable as a result of adverse situations. And we can accept the circumstances that cannot be changed, which helps us to focus on circumstances that we can alter. So you might think about how you've altered your behaviors, thoughts, and or feelings since the pandemic. And I'm sure that all of you have made some changes. There's some wonderful additional resource material on resilience. And Donald Meichenbaum has done a wonderfully rich document and made it freely accessible. which if you look at his roadmap to resilience, you will find that you can click on all these individual items, and it then opens up more pages of information about those particular things. And one that I particularly liked was clicking on this link on rumination, which it's so easy right now to be ruminating. Professor Ann Maston has also done a podcast about resilience that you might enjoy, so that is the link for that. So our next steps in our research, we're going to try to further refine and develop our self-care inventory, adding further items based on current self-care strategies, and using external validity of other measures of well-being, resilience, and grit. We quite like Angela Duckworth's work on grit. And we're looking to do either thematic analysis or IPA-based analyses of interviews to look at how particular people are managing to self-care.
And particularly with the emphasis on the particular stressors and other issues that people are dealing with currently, and how actually there may be a need to reformulate understandings of self-care for this new and changed environment.
That's right. So to just go back to our swimmer model, it's about finding your own conclusions, and it's kind of sink or swim. And with that thought, we'd like to open up to questions, which you will probably best do on the chat function, but we do have the capacity to.
Yeah, people can put their mic.
If you want to turn on your mic one at a time. Yeah.
Not that people don't do it as once, as most people realise. With this, it can be terrible if there's a.
That's right.
Cacophony.
So over to you for any comments or questions. And thank you for listening.
Absolutely.
Well, nobody else seems to be jumping in at the moment. So I suppose I wonder, do you feel, this kind of thing that I've been thinking about since early on in your talk, you obviously talked about your measure of the self-care inventory. Is that kind of the best way you view to look at well-being, to maintain this systematic way of looking at your own well-being? Because it does seem that you're right, that actually noticing that something's wrong can be half the battle or more.
Well, one of the things that inspired me in the self-care inventory was like, we take our cars for an MOT, and some people, particularly when they get older, might go for a yearly checkup with the doctor. But like, what kind of regular monitoring do we have of our emotional health? Even though, as we said, it's a professional imperative, what do we really do? How do we really put that in practice? And because we are responsible for our own self-care, or another way I like to put that is we're the manager of our own self-care, because it's very internal and private. So other people may give you some insight, like you don't look as well as normal, you look worried and things like that. But really, we have to self-inventory. We know ourselves the best. We know what's going on internally. And so the idea there was, yes, to prompt us to take some kind of regular inventory. Depending on where you're at, that could be less or more frequent.
I think it also depends on what the inventory is designed to do and who is it for. And really our initial thinking was that the inventory would be a useful tool for mental health professionals to use to be able to determine if they were using enough self-care in their lives, or if they could do with doing more to look after themselves, in order to fulfill their ethical and professional requirements in that sense. I think it's another question as to whether the inventory can be used more widely, either as some kind of diagnostic test as to whether self-care is being properly self-administered in that way. I'm not sure yet, personally, whether we will end up finding actually that in some respects, the more that we try to do it quantitatively, the more that this turns out to be very similar perhaps to other constructs or concepts, such as coping. And of course, there are some really good coping instruments out there, or indeed, as I mentioned already, similar to notions of resilience. I think either way, I think it's very important, though, this is just my own personal philosophy about methods, to use multi-methods and also not to be afraid to particularize quantitative instruments for particular contexts and circumstances, or indeed to allow individuals to, in one sense, make it individual for themselves as to how they're responding in particular ways. And otherwise there can be a great propensity, I think, sometimes for there to be false negatives around things like this, when if the question had been phrased differently, people may have answered more in the affirmative. So that's why we're kind of pursuing the twin track of also looking qualitatively over the period ahead. And we know that lots of other people are doing research of this nature, but particularly looking at these self-care principles as to how people are deploying them perhaps differently in the context of the pandemic compared to how they were doing previously. And hopefully that might inform then the development of an inventory moving forward.
Lovely. So perhaps a bit of a loaded question to follow on from that, depending on who's still in the room. Do you feel that employers then, from a kind of occupational standpoint, have a duty to make available the time for this? Do you feel that it's something that employers should be encouraging, or is this something that we should be looking at purely managing ourselves with our free time, as it were?
I think that's a really good question, and it was actually something I thought about mentioning just now as I was going along, but I was speaking for such a long time I decided to stop anyway. But yeah, I think our initial findings that work-life balance was a key aspect of self-care indicates to me very much that there is a responsibility on all employers and on all organisations to ensure that there is time for self-care, just as there's time for looking after well-being. These are synonymous terms, I think, in that regard. It's that space. And so there is an onus, I think, with a lot of these concepts these days, and that includes terms like resilience and grit, that this is solely the personal responsibility of an individual, as if we exist in even more isolation than perhaps we think we do. But actually, of course, it's the pressures from others, including from employers sometimes, that make it hard to look after oneself. And we're seeing that writ large, of course, for hundreds of thousands of workers who are either already on the front line or who are faced imminently with going back to it. And so I completely agree with the what's behind your question. I think, Sam, that I think that there needs to be a collective responsibility, including from employers and government and everyone, to ensure that self-care can be facilitated. And I think we need to get the emphasis right in that regard.
Well, hopefully the difficulties that we're experiencing in the world might help some of the employers, including our own, to be a little more sensitive to what our personal needs are. And I'm hopeful that some of that might be demonstrated, because it is really important and there is a duty of care towards employees. But I do think ultimately we are our own managers, because we know ourselves the best in terms of what we need.
Yeah, so we need the space from the employers and the government, etc., but we need to be able to learn to support ourselves in a way, and
yes,
support, of course, where we need it.
Yes.
Well, yes,
Yes.
that's why the social support is so important, which is acknowledged, of course, in well-being more generally, but I think is also important with regard to self-care in particular. You could even argue, therefore, that self-care is also self-care, but also care from others. That you can't do proper self-care if you're not being looked after by other people. and what being looked after means, of course, is going to change and is already changing, I think. And some of the work that's being done in schools right now with regard to looked after children, or indeed vulnerable children, kind of shows how online technologies on occasions are actually helping vulnerable young people to be looked after sometimes better than they would have been in the non-online world. So in a sense, it's how do we take the positives while also recognizing that for some people those are not positives.
So I guess we'll ask, is there any more questions for Linda and Rod? Well, it doesn't appear so right at this moment. So I guess we'll say thank you very much, Linda and Rod, for your presentation. Very interesting, of course. I believe this is the last seminar in our series for the year. So I guess we'll be notifying people of when things are kicking up again. This presentation has been recorded, so we'll be looking to get it uploaded to the YouTube channel at some point.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
See you all soon. Bye.
Yeah, remember to take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Take care.